Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us on the webinar, How to Effectively Engage with Smart Device Users. My name is Liz Kugowski, and I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Customer Strategist Journal. And I'm joined today by Peter Dorrington, who is a Director of Customer Insights for Teletech Consulting. Back a few months ago, we worked on an article about using data in omnichannel journeys that we published in the Customer Strategist Journal. And it sparked some interest in the discussion of the idea of omnichannel data and mobile users in the digital age. So Peter has taken his expertise and insights and created a presentation for you today about engaging mobile users in this digital world. So welcome, Peter, and with that I will hand it off to you to present us with your webinar.
So thank you, Liz. What I'd like to do just before I start in the real meat of the content is just take a few seconds to introduce myself, which explains the context of this presentation. So my first job was as a rocket scientist, more accurately an engineer, so working on the engineering problems involved with getting things into space. Then an early employee at Vodafone, when we could all fit into a single office above a restaurant in Newbury, and then a series of career changes in sales management, working for a helicopter company, leading a knowledge management and BI consulting practice before running for SaaS for 14 years in a variety of roles in Europe, and then 3 years in mobile and digital analytics for mobile banking apps before joining Teletech Consulting. So, to sum that all up, I'm all things data and analytics. I think a lot about how customer insights can help us build better relationships with our clients and run a more effective business. But my focus is on thinking about the right kinds of questions to ask, so that would make me more of an analytics officer than a data scientist, who are the really clever people who come up with the how to answer the question part. But this presentation will cover a bit of both. There'll be some business rationale associated with it, and then some guidance on the answers. So what I'd like to firstly do is just think about the world we live in at the moment. So mobility and digital are driving so many business agendas at the moment. And that's a reflection of the way that the world currently works. When I started working at Vodafone, mobiles really could just about make calls. You didn't get very many calling minutes out of a battery the size of a car battery, and they were phenomenally expensive. Now there are over 2 billion smartphone users, and that doesn't include all the other kinds of smart device. And I'll come to some of those in a moment. At Teletech, one of the things that got me interested in this is the phenomenal number of calls that we handle as an organization. Nearly 1 billion a month. Now that gives us a lot of frontline experience with dealing with customers and thinking about customer experience. But one thing that shines through from all of these smart device users is that there's a new normal in play. They're always on. They want to use any channel they like, whenever they like, and however they like. And if we're not reflecting that efficiently and effectively in the way that we operate, we're in danger of losing ground to some of those more disruptive organizations that are making the headlines right now. So what I'd like to just do before I go much further is take a moment to define a couple of aspects from this. The first of which is, what's a smart device? Well, what it's not is a smaller version of a PC screen. So it's not a cut-down PC experience. It's a completely different experience with completely different user expectations. And that's not just a mobile phone. That's tablets, laptops, phablets, wearables, online automotive vehicles, telematics, Internet of Things, a whole slew of different devices, all of which are contributing to something that's called big data. And the analysis of big data and the analysis of the data that we get from these devices allows us to market in new ways to these new channels. And the context for this is omnichannel. So omnichannel is itself an evolution. if we look at some of the early forerunners, and there are still a few companies that think like this, the first iterations were multiple channel, where there were 2 or more channels, for example, retail and call center, or web and other forms of online, but each of them were treated as an individual channel. They look and they feel different both to the organization and to the consumer. And that's very noticeable. And that's not a very efficient or pleasant user experience. So rapidly, many organizations went down the route of integrating at the back end within their own organization. So they're focused on an individual customer or consumer, but now they're integrating the data. However, multi-channel is typified by the integration being at the data layer and the channels feeling substantially different. Even though the customer is remembered between channels and can switch channels, they feel like it's a different experience. But more worryingly, the customer is still exposed to too much of our process as an organization rather than their journey. So in my view, truly omni-channel working is where we have fully integrated channels at the front end. So channel integration is focused entirely on the customer and the customer experience, customer journey. And I'd like to give a very short story to illustrate the difference between multi-channel and omni-channel. A few months ago, I bought a pair of shoes online. I couldn't get it from my local store in the color that I wanted. They were being shipped from the manufacturer, but before they arrived at the collection point, there was a fire. So the shoes couldn't be delivered. And the first I heard was I get a text message saying there's a problem with my order. I have to contact the manufacturer. We then spend nearly an hour discussing options about how I could get my shoes, with me ending up having to reorder exactly the same shoes so that I could get them delivered to my house rather than a collection point. I was exposed to the organization's process and its process failings. There was no fault on either side, but it was definitely not a very pleasant user experience. So I would typify that organization as multi-channel rather than omni-channel. And one element of all of this is context, which is at the heart of relevancy. Now, context can be summarized as 3 things. What am I trying to do? When am I trying to do it? And where am I trying to do it from? So we can instrument a lot of that through smart devices by appropriate uses of things like tagging, capturing information about time, date, location, and exactly what I'm doing on screen. But none of these things really tell you a lot about why I am trying to do what I am doing. So the way that we can use this is typically to decide whether we include somebody within an action or reaction. So as a result of the context and relevancy, we can focus perhaps a marketing communication or direct somebody to the right service level. But it's very reactive. And what we would ideally want to improve this is to actually make it more proactive. But before we can even get to that point, we really need to understand the customer themselves. And we have a golden opportunity, digital devices, these smart devices. So we can look at how we can use that. And what I'd like to do is talk about a real-world example I worked on, where we were identifying content to be matched to users. And to do this, I would like to introduce Anna. Now, Anna is a persona. So this is somebody that, without asking any personally identifiable information, things like age, gender, where they work, salary, and so on, we actually got a very strong impression of who Anna was. And her persona could be typified as a younger professional woman living an aspirational lifestyle on a budget. So she wants the finer things of life, but she doesn't have the income to pay for them all. So she's somewhat cost conscious, but aware of luxury items. So we could write an entire persona based around Anna, derived from nothing more than observation of her behavior. And the kinds of things that Anna was interested in were things like fashion and accessories, health and fitness, dining out, culture and events. Now, for many organizations, this is enough. This is all they really think that they need to know about Anna. But one of the other things that we identified through the digital channel was that Anna is not a consistent persona. And if we were to think of her as micro segments, she actually changes segments depending upon time of day, day of week, and week within the month and month within the year. And that was very much brought out by looking at Anna's behaviour over a typical working day. So we could see that at night she's asleep. In the morning, she's getting up and she's checking her overnight deals. So has there been a daily deal that might interest her? And she's doing this on her commute into work. During the morning, she's starting to think about lunch. So she's looking at things like, is there a lunch deal going on? Is there something I can do? Or maybe I could do a quick bit of shopping during my lunch session. In the afternoon, we would call her behaviour sneaky peeking. She's taking a few minutes here or there around coffee breaks to do a little bit more online research and shopping. And she may be identifying things she wants to look at later on. And then on the way home, she's thinking about dinner and where she might go out for dinner. And then in the evening, when she has access to another device with a bigger screen, she's dual screen behaviour. So she's actually looking at things which are too complex or big to fit onto a small screen, i.e. her mobile, so she wants to check them out on a tablet or a full-size PC. So what we could see here was not only do we know when Anna is active and what she's looking for at different times of day, but that also changes for things like at the beginning of the month when she's more receptive to luxury optional spend items rather than the end of the month when she's stretching out the monthly paycheck. Now, that was one side of the equation. When it came to the other side of the equation about how do we match the kinds of content that we think that Anna or other profiles or segments might be appreciated, we get into interesting debates about how do you categorize content. And I'll use the illustration of a wristwatch. So is a wristwatch jewelry, accessory? Is it clothing, a timepiece, a necessity, or decorative? And what really brought this home for me was a character called Joey Essex, who really doesn't know how to tell a time with an analog watch and had to be taught this as an adult. He'd only perceived watches as jewelry. So if Joey was looking for a watch, he'd expect to see it in jewelry and wouldn't even think of it as a timepiece. So, to summarize, even if we have a profile, we have to think through smart device world that the profile could be split into micro-segments. Every micro-segment may have a different message or different content associated with it, and we know when to pitch and cadence those. What we can't do is spam. So during this day, we can't send an Anna 5 or 6 different messages every single day. We would rapidly exhaust her goodwill, and that would then lead to a very negative customer experience from her point of view. But it is something that we can do which is much more difficult to do using traditional channels. So at the heart of all of this insight into users is data. And a lot of people have been talking about big data, and I mentioned it right at the start of this presentation. These smart devices are a source of almost infinite big data. And the definition here is typically the 3 V's: volume, there's a lot of it; velocity, it's coming in at high speed and different speeds; and variation or variability. There are all sorts, everything from text through to looking at a particular transaction to a time of day. Now there are lots of other V's we could add to this: veracity, visualization, and so on. I've seen up to 7, but you can have as many as you can think of for V's. Essentially, big data is big, it's complicated, and we do need to think carefully about how we use it. In the past, we were much more comfortable with structured data, data that fits into tables or data sets. So it has structure and formats, and it's predictable in its shape. So this is ideal for things like predictive analytics, but it's the blend of the two together where we can get some real insights when we look at things like text. So the analysis of text allows us to bring in context or themes that we might otherwise miss. So a conversation is likely to touch upon many things we didn't predict would fit into a table. In the world of big data, a lot is being done with what's called self-declared data. So this is very easy to store. We essentially give the name of the variable, and then the value of the variable. So in the example I've written on the bottom of this slide, we can see my employee name is Peter Dorrington, my age, my gender, and I have 2 children who have names. I've marked the children in red for a reason. When we think in big data, often what we want to do with semi-declared data is default to store it all. Storage is cheap. If we store it all as it comes in and we self-declare what it is, we can sort it all out later. But some of the predictive tools really struggle with things like arrays within this. So this array of children, I have 2 children and they have 2 names. Many of the translation tools that deal with this kind of data, this format's JSON, but it could be XML or some other, really struggle with arrays or hierarchical variables. So when you're thinking about this, I would always recommend get a data scientist to help you plan how you're going to store your data, and think about a hybrid approach. Have the big data stores, and you can have the self-declared or unstructured data, but also think about what data should automatically go into a data set. And when you plan the data, it's much more likely that you won't forget to store something that will be useful for an analyst. Because one of the biggest dangers with going down this route about not thinking about the data you're storing is you will not store a key piece of information that maybe a year down the line you wish you'd recorded, but now of course it's too late. So my advice here is by all means engage with big data, and storage is cheap, but get some expert help and don't rely on a database designer or IT to solve this for you. A data designer or data scientist will be able to give you really good advice and provide you with a long-term solution. And it is truly amazing what you can get from a smart device. I've given here some examples of the kinds of things which are typical that you can derive without the user having to actually change any of the settings on their mobile device. So you can pick up information about the device, about the app, about the way it's been used, session times, both logical, that is, if I have an interruption in service, I'm still thought of as one service, versus the physical. And we can even have some unique user identifiers. And what I'd like to do is just, for the moment, separate the device ID, which is not unique to a user. After all, a device can be handed from one user to another user, it can be sold on or perhaps given to a family member, as opposed to a unique user ID, which can be tokenized and is unique to an individual user. Now, none of this data is normally considered PII. That's personally identifiable information. It doesn't reveal anything about the user, such as their name or their address, phone numbers or bank details. So it's usually, as I say, not considered PII, with one exception which is debatable in some territories and by some organizations, which are user IDs. If an organization has an ability to match a user ID to a real person, they may perceive that the user ID should be included within PII. If that is the case, just tokenize it so that it is not reverse engineerable. And then that will give you the ability to do all the analyses you like, even link it back to an action without actually having to break privacy rules or invoke some of the challenges with data protection. So there's a huge stream of data, and as I said, this is before we've even started to instrument the application itself. But when you do instrument the application, you do learn an awful lot more. So I've got 2 examples here. You don't need to read them, I'll just explain them. On the left-hand side of the screen is a river diagram or a Sankey diagram, which shows graphically how users navigate through the experience. So they start on the left, a majority of them seem to go on to the next screen. The majority of those people go on to the next screen. There are some drop-offs, the red bars, and then there are some people who go off down a slightly different route. For screen flow to work, you need to name every single screen and every single overlay, and you need to do it in a way that you can understand what those tags mean when you see them in a report like this. So screen 1, 2, 3 leading to screen 4, 5, 6 is not terribly informative to anybody other than the app developer. But for a marketer, if it's this is the load screen, leads to the login screen, leads to the quick menu screen. That makes a lot more sense. So tag all the screens and tag them in plain language. On the right-hand side is a different approach. This is a conversion funnel or path to goal. Now this is about recording specific user actions on the device within the app. And this assumes that there's a linear path from the first step to the goal step. And in this case, there are 5 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, goal. You don't need to instrument every user interaction, every button press, every click, every hover over. Really all we're interested in here are the summary points. So let me give you an illustration. If part of your process is that somebody enters their home address, you don't need to record every single line of the home address as a step in a conversion funnel. All you really need to record is that they successfully submit an address that is valid. Move on to the next step. So you can aggregate these. So keep the funnels simple, summarize to a level which enables you to make sense. You will need one conversion funnel for every path to goal. You can't have branching in these funnels. So unlike ScreenFlow, which can be semi-random and unpredictable, a conversion funnel should be predictable. Step 2 should always follow step 1 and should always precede step 3 in a particular funnel. And again, label the actions in a way that makes sense to you. And you don't have to record the information within the button press. So if there's a monetary transaction involved, you don't need to record the value of the transaction, just that the transaction happened. So as you can see, once we instrument the app and we add that to the things that we get from the device-app combination, that's an incredibly rich source of insight into users and what they're doing. Now, in this particular case, I just wanted to highlight one thing. These red bars show there's a lot of dropouts. That's important when you want to find a break in your user experience. And examples I've seen of these are people adding items to a shopping basket. They go to the basket and there's no checkout button. So they can't actually go any further in the process. So it's worth looking at the red bars. If they're in an unexpected place, is it because there's a problem within the design of the app rather than in the overall process itself? Now the challenge with instrumenting an app is that it's only telling part of a story. So in this analog of a game of snakes and ladders, the mobile or tablets are being used at different times, and sometimes they help the process and sometimes they get in the way. So one of the things we have to do is think of the mobile experience as a subset of the overall customer experience. It's rare that a customer journey starts and ends solely within one device. And it may be that we have a mixture, as I had with my shoes, of store, phone, mobile, text, trying to work out a whole range of things with the emails. You need to think about the entirety of the customer journey from start to finish and where the things you observe fit within that process. You will see that there are lots of gaps, and that's quite normal. We should anticipate that. So the journeys aren't really linear, although it would be ideal if customers just went straight from start to finish in one go. But what we need to do is to put all of that into a context, and we need to put it into the context of people and not machines or mechanisms. And this is where, when I joined Teletech, for me, I had an epiphany moment. As an analyst, I've always been interested in observations, the things I can see, the manifest behavior. So if I can measure it, if I can see it, then I can analyze it. And typically that would be the questions like who and what and where and when and how much and how frequently and so on. The quant side of the relationship. But why was always something a little bit more obscure. Why do people exhibit these behaviors? What's driving them? What's motivating them? And because I can't stick a probe in somebody's head and measure it directly, the best I could do was try and infer it through thinking a little bit more about, well, what are people like? Now, in my early career, I mentioned that I worked in astronomy and astroscience. And there's something in astronomy we call dark matter. If you look up into the night sky, even with the world's most powerful telescopes, you can only see 70% of what we know is there. 30% of it is what we call dark matter. We know it exists, we can see its effects, but we can't see it directly. And motivation and emotion is like dark matter to analysts. We know it's there and the math is dependent upon it, but in the past it's always been very difficult to include that. But now there are techniques where we can, and we can start to think about some of the behavioral sciences and the ways that we can take those into account. And that's really critical, as I'll explain in the next slide. It matters because as human beings, we are neither wholly logical or wholly illogical. We're biological. So all of the decisions that we make have some element of emotion built into them, some element of behavior which is not solely a logical construct from here to there. As I say, for quants people, this can be really difficult. We can see the effects of decisions, but why do people not always act logically? Why do they make illogical decisions? And we try to address some of this with surveys, and we ask questions about, well, why did you do what you do? And I'd like to give another example from my personal life, from my poor wife, who I use a lot for case studies. A couple of years ago, she was in the market for a new car. And we were thinking about what kind of cars, and she decided that she wanted a Volkswagen Beetle, one of the new shape VWs. That's her decision. I was happy to support that in her. Now, if I had asked her why she chose that vehicle, she would consciously think about the answer, take into account who was asking, her very logical husband who likes to have rational reasons for things, and I'm sure she could have come up with 5 rational reasons why she wanted the Volkswagen Beetle, and it was the car for her. The real reason was almost entirely emotional, and it was the way in which she perceives herself as sitting in that vehicle and being seen by others. A slightly funky mummy in a slightly funky car, but still very mainstream, not too way out. And that for her was a real driver. It was the design, the feel, the emotional resonance she had with that vehicle. The logical part was almost just hygiene. It was about, is it affordable? Does it make sense? Is it going to be reliable? All the other questions that if we were solely rational, we would ask. And perhaps if we were solely rational, she may not have chosen a VW Beetle, but gone for something else. So I've been leading up to a point here. We've actually got this ability to get all of the quant information, all of those data points that we can directly observe. In the past, we've tried to ask questions about why do people make the decisions they make. And we can draw some inferences from those. And that's important because it influences the way that we think and act in the future. And one of the things that's led is something called the customer experience vector. So I'm going to use an illustration based upon satisfaction scores. And that's one that a lot of people are very familiar with. If we took today's date and I asked a consumer, how satisfied are you with your relationship with my organization at the moment? I'm sure that they would give an answer. And that answer would be aggregated with others, and we would get an overall check with that. Now, a lot of organizations have been thinking about, well, what are the causes behind those levels of satisfaction? And try things like regression. So we look back at all of the previous things that have happened, some of them positive, some of them negative, and we try to end up with what the score today would be. And we aggregate that. And we don't have to survey quite so much because smart devices are providing us with an incredible resource in terms of data. And we can evaluate that data in terms of its positive or negative impact. When we do that, and using a number of other techniques that we've extracted from behavioral science, not only can we get a score for where we are today, but we can predict into the future which direction it's likely to go. So in this particular case, it's on a downwards trend, and it's a fairly shallow curve, so we have some time to remediate here. Now, this is a slightly richer version of using satisfaction than perhaps some people are used to, but why bother? It's a lot of effort, we might think, to get something that's predictive. Well, it's actually important because the way we think about the next interaction is very much based upon the way that we're feeling about the organization. And I'll give an example. This is one that's been used quite a lot in some of the behavioral economics kinds of studies, the wine list example. So anybody goes into a restaurant and you'll see there's a wine list, and there's a range of prices and a range of grapes. Now, putting to one side the special case of wine buffs who really understand wines and the grape varieties and what they ought to buy, if you're like me and you're uncertain about what kind of wine to buy, you will probably go for somewhere middle of the road for a variety that you've heard of before. So if I was to lay out the prices in a logical sequence and say, well, there's an upper and a lower range of price, there's a mean point, more accurately a median point, the mid price, and then there's a range around that midpoint, most people will pick somewhere within that midpoint range. However, if we understand human behavior, we know that if we put some high-price wines or some high-price items into the menu, that actually will shift the median point up. So the middle point moves. And that's the new middle point. And the result of that will be more purchases of wines around a new, higher middle point. So we've subtly influenced user behavior based upon our experience of the way that people make decisions. So they typically are sloppy thinkers. We tend to go for things that are average or in the middle. We avoid extremes. Now think about that from the example of satisfaction. If I'm really satisfied with a current provider and they make a mistake, I'm quite likely that I will forgive that and it will have no major impact. However, if they've made a whole series of quite minor mistakes over a period of time, I'm going to start thinking more negatively about them. At that point, it's not the right time to try and sell me more of a service that I'm beginning to feel negatively about. It's time to fix the relationship. So we can prejudge how we modify the next step in the behavior. Now, we can't observe everything, of course. There always are going to be some unobservable bits of data. But experimentation has shown that there are really important techniques that we can use here which can help organizations deliver better customer experiences, retain customers for longer, and deliver more value out of them. Now, I've talked a lot about what's been going on in the brain. I'd like to just shift back for a moment to what's going on actually inside the metrics. And here's some of the critical measures that we need to be thinking about when we're working with smart devices. And there's two that you'll see aren't there. Downloads, so how many people have downloaded or initially engaged with our application, and click-throughs that are treated on their own. And the reason that I've not included those is they can actually be misleading representations of success. There are much better measures of success, including things like the number of people who become active and stay active, how long they're within the experience in individual sessions and logical sessions, how frequently they're coming back, how many of them are having happy journeys versus unexpected outcomes or abandonments, those red blocks, and things like proxies for value. So we could actually give a notional value to something like a button click and say, well, one button click equals 3 ticks, one offer activation equals 5 ticks, and therefore we can end up with a value for an individual customer. And we can relate that to satisfaction. And then right at the top of the list, when we apply that to our marketing acquisition strategies, we now know the economic success of individual marketing campaigns. So we can see that a campaign may appear to get fewer users than a different campaign, but those fewer users are more economically active than the larger user base and stay loyal for longer. So these are some of the critical measures of success. Then there's what I would say is when things are really optimized for mobile, what does it mean? And this is perhaps one of my personal bugbears. Not all media is suitable for small footprint devices. So when I was talking about Anna and the way in which during the day she's using her mobile and at night she's using a big screen, for different users there is a definite generation split between the fingers and thumbs generation. So thumbs generation typically are younger, people who use mobiles. Fingers generation are slightly older and typically use a PC or a laptop or tablet. But not all the content on supposedly optimized for mobile sites are actually very mobile friendly. So there's a couple of things to bear in mind. The first of which is that experience shows that sessions on smart devices are typically much shorter than you could expect on something like a PC. It's more like a grazing behavior, perhaps, than browsing. Take a little bite, move on, take a little bite of something else. And you can see that with the frequency of people flipping between various screens on devices, unloading, uploading apps, and switching. So you've got very little attention span. The analog for that always used to be above the fold in newsprint. Front page above the fold is the only bit that you could reasonably expect people to see. On a mobile device, it's the front screen. Everything has to fit in the front screen. Swiping or scrolling is a definite no-no. So optimize your experience so that you don't take up loads of real estate with things like terms and conditions and text in small fonts. The other thing to do is to bear in mind that not all media is suitable for smart devices. A PDF which looks wonderful in full-size A4 is really painful to read on a 5-inch screen. If the font is really small, then people like me can't read it without having to use reading glasses or trying to hold the device so far away that the font's so small I couldn't read it anyway, even if I could focus. So when you're thinking about smart devices, think about different screen formats and think about how much of it needs to be on the front page. What gets prominent? What is really important? And then optimize around that. And finally, please resist the urge to put a 2 GB image or video file on the front page of your mobile device. If I'm on a low bandwidth 3G connection, that takes forever and will eat my entire data allocation before I even get to the main meat of your content. In summary, I'd like to just say there are 10 things that I believe are the must-dos of smart device engagement or marketing. First of which is, it's really easy to write an app, but before you do, please give a moment's thought and think about your strategy, not only for the way in which the app will work, but how it will help you engage and get insights into your customers. And be relevant. Focus in on what's important to the consumer, especially on smaller screen mobiles. And they don't come with permission to spam. Just because you can reach them doesn't mean to say that you should. So make sure you have the right cadence. And when you do have their attention, be clear, both with the customers and with yourselves. So use plain language throughout. No codes, no acronyms, nothing that doesn't stand alone as instantly readable text. Now try and balance that with brevity. So you want to be bright, you want to be brief, and then you want to be gone. Assume that every browser that's looking at your screen is going to at most spend 20 to 30 seconds before their attention wanders. So you have to be very concise in your message. One of the things that I've seen has definitely been the case is fatigue about surveys and filters. People are just getting frustrated with constantly having to fill in questions or make selections from menu boxes before they get to the real value. And why do we ask these things? Many of them we could actually infer or we should already know. So if you do know, don't ask. But respect privacy. So I talked about some techniques about avoiding using PII. You don't need PII to do analysis, but you do need some of it to deliver a message. So be open about what you're doing. Tell people why you're doing what you're doing, even if they don't see your data gathering process. And obviously, instrument the experience. Use tags wisely. You have an amazing ability to gather data off these devices, but you could end up confusing yourself with a tag storm with so many pieces of information coming in you don't know how to evaluate or respond to them. Drive content onto the key screen and make sure that all of them are labeled in a clear way. And say, avoid that tag frenzy. And first and foremost, always put the customer first. And I'd like to leave you with some parting thoughts before I get back to Liz. So these are some statistics I came across recently. 20% of apps are used only once. 70% of users abandon an app after 3 days. 95% of users abandon an app within 90 days. And only 40% of apps are used more than 11 times. Now that's a frightening set of statistics. And the reason it's frightening is that of those users that we lose, whether they unload our app or simply stop using it, it's very hard to win them back. So the golden opportunity comes with a great big risk. If we miss the opportunity or if we misuse it, we have the ability to actually close our own market down, and that's entirely within our gift. And with that, I'd like to hand back to Liz.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was such a fantastic presentation full of some wonderful insights and recommendations for incorporating data and analytics best practices for omnichannel and digital mobile customer engagement. So this is a topic, as I mentioned, that came from a Customer Strategist journal article called Giving Omnichannel a Data Twist that Peter wrote. If you're interested in downloading that article, you can visit the Customer Strategist journal page either on teletech.com or on the link below, the bit.ly link. You can type in and subscribe to the journal or just grab the article that you're interested in. We also think this is a topic around customer insights, customer strategy. This is a whole conversation that should be kept going because customers and customer experience continuously evolves. So we encourage you to join the CX in Action community on LinkedIn, where it's a community of practitioners and experts who discuss these sorts of topics all the time. So we encourage you to go check that out. And there's a newsletter as well you can sign up for. And finally, just keep up with us on social media. My Twitter handle is there, so is Peter's, as well as Teletech Consulting's. And please visit us on LinkedIn and Facebook. We'd love to have conversations and learn from what's going on in the market. So thank you all for attending today's webinar. We hope to keep this conversation going on such a wonderful topic. And Peter, thank you so much for all of your wonderful insight.
My pleasure.